So I'm going to be talking with you about the impact of the contraceptive mentality. Les has talked about, the rapid explosion of STDs because of the use of contraceptives. Something far more pathologic has happened to the human person because of the use of contraceptives. To the sacrament of marriage, the sacrament of holy orders, Catholic educators, Catholic physicians, the extent of this is extraordinary. I was preparing 2 weeks ago. I teach a course every week at John Paul II Institute for Studies in Marriage and Family in Washington, D.C. at Catholic University this year. And I was preparing two lectures on this topic. I'm going to try to condense those 2 hours into 1 hour, so bear with me here. No, less than 1 hour, 40 minutes. And it just hit me as I was preparing this topic. I was thinking, oh my God, this is extraordinary what's happened over the past 40 years, to the sacrament of marriages, to families, to the priesthood, to Catholic education, to Catholic health care. It's extraordinary what's happened. To the culture. And so I'm going to be positive ultimately, but we have to review some damage. Now, psychologically, let me just highlight psychologically what happens. Things that happen psychologically. When you contracept, you make a double act of mistrust. Okay, a double act of mistrust. And trust is the whole foundation for loving. So you don't give yourself to people, you don't receive unless you trust. Which is why on our marital website, maritalhealing.com, the most frequently hit chapter on our website is the controlling spouse. Okay? That surprised me. I thought because the most common thing that brings couples into therapy is excessive anger. But I came to appreciate why this is the case, because of the mistrust, the growth in narcissism. So when you contracept, you are saying to your spouse, I do not trust you with part of who I am. I do not trust you with my fertility, so I withhold a full trust, full self-giving to you. You are also saying to God, I don't trust you either. And married love is demanding, as Paul tells us, We have to be loyal to the end. And without God's grace, it's very difficult. And so we see this explosion in divorce because of the contraceptive mentality. Also what happens when you contracept, you turn in on yourself. And as many popes have written, the major enemy of marital love is selfishness. So what happens when you contracept, trust drops, anger rises as trust drops, selfishness grows. And then also what happens is you wound the deepest sense of who you are as a person. Because as John Paul II, so oftentimes when he quoted the Second Vatican Council, he said, we find ourselves fundamentally through a gift of self-giving. It's through giving ourselves that we find fulfillment. And so what happens is you withhold self-giving. And when you do that, your sense of masculinity, who you are as a man, your fatherhood diminishes. Who you are as a woman, your full identity as a woman, as a giving, nurturing woman, that diminishes also. So infidelity rises as you feel more inadequate in your masculinity, you feel more inadequate in your femininity, and you seek out others to get a fix, to boost your weak sense of who you are. So these are some of the basic things that occur. Now this presentation and the previous presentation, Les has informed me, and George Asayu, you'll be able to soon link to on the Catholic Medical Association website. It's their cathmedphil.org. It's being redone right now, but it should be up and operating soon. Again, so this presentation will be, hopefully, if Bill Williams approves of it, up. Okay, so the damage and disease, marriage, children, holy orders, religious life, Catholic education has been devastated. I had a student at one of the nearby Catholic universities recently, and second year in her humanities courses she reviewed with me, every one of my professors, not one of my professors accepts the church's teaching on human sexuality. Okay? It is as if try to get a position at a university, at a Catholic university, so-called Catholic university, when you accept the church's teaching. Very difficult. Very, very difficult. It's almost like this is the criteria. And so we've had this rejection. And with rejection, my specialty as a psychiatrist is the nature of anger. So if you go to our website, you'll see a textbook, American Psychological Association books. So we've had this rebellion and this massive growth of anger within the heart of the church. within our healthcare systems, within our educations of higher learning, not even higher learning, high schools, elementary schools. So you have this massive rebellion in this one key area, human sexuality. It's remarkable. Now here's the great gift. Here's one of the greatest gifts we as a church in the United States have received, this new document, Married Love and the Gift of Life. I wrote Cardinal Regali a letter this week. He had an article in the Catholic Standard last week on this document, a magnificent article by Cardinal Regali on this document. I wrote a letter thanking him so much for this article he wrote on this document and asking this document couldn't be given out to every couple prior to marriage, used in pre-Cana programs and marriage encounter programs and retrolife programs, because so much pathology, this explosion, as Les was saying, of people who want tranquilizing medications, antidepressant medications. So much psychopathology arises out of the contraceptive mentality. We're not being who we really are, we're called to be. And you pay a price for that. And you suffer for that. Okay, whoops, going the wrong way here. So now, some of the great gifts. Some of the great gifts are John Paul II, his writings. Prophetic voice, I think, from George Weigel in his book Witness to Hope on John Paul II, in which he predicts that his writings will constitute a theological time bomb, set to go off with dramatic consequences sometime in the third millennium of the church. It's beginning now. Let's review for a moment the warnings of Paul VI and Humanae Vitae that happened. So we have this explosion of divorce, STDs, break the moral law. We have these young people in college students, numerous, we have many college students we treat, total pessimism about human love. You know? George talked about, Les talked about 5 sexual partners per year for heterosexuals. Those who engage in homosexual behaviors, the figure ranges between 15, 20, 30 per year. As one author wrote, with this, the homosexualization of heterosexuality, the total collapse of all moral codes, a total lack of reverence for women. The next speaker, Brad, has a tremendous article, research and paper he's done on what's happened to men, this explosion of narcissism in single men, substance abuse, total irresponsibility, not growing in maturity as men, total weakening of masculinity. I would recommend that you read, this is from John Paul II's The Role of the Christian Family in the Modern World, Familiaris Consortio. He writes about the damage to giving that occurs when couples contracept, total altering of self-giving. It leads to a falsification of the inner truth of conjugal love. You realize the moment when you should be most surrendered to your loved one, you say to that person, I'm not going to surrender to you. And in that process, there's a sadness that occurs in the heart of a man and the heart of a woman, because the loving is a lie. It's not true loving. It's not complete self-giving. And so each partner suffers as a result of that. This then makes them vulnerable. I'm unhappy. I'm unhappy in my marriage. I'm happy. It must be my spouse's fault. Get me out of here. When in fact, they've contributed to it in a major way, and you oftentimes throw the baby away with the bathwater in this divorce culture that we're in. He goes on to say, John Paul II, in Letter to Families, I would highly recommend, if you haven't read Letter to Families, this is another document that should be read, should be given on all pre-Cana programs. In which John Paul II, in Letter to Families, writes, safe sex is radically not safe, extremely dangerous to the person, to the couple, denies the truth about who a person really is, will have devastating impacts. This safe sex, a devastating impact on marriages and family. So what happens when couples contracept? They exclude God from their intimacy. They rebel against him. They say, I will be God. You will not be God. I will be God of my fertility. And so your trust in God as a spouse begins to diminish. And if you want a happy married life, and you want to learn how to deal with stresses in married life, and deal with the demanding love that married life requires, you need to trust in God. Because if you don't have a trust in God, then your anxiety level is going to go, and Dr. Rupersberg, please give me some Zoloft, or Dr. Fitzgibbons, please give me a serotonin drug, because I'm anxious. So you withhold trust, you follow poorly formed consciences, it leads to a massive, major rebellion against the church. It wounds when the couples contracept, their communication is often wounded. They give in to the culture, the whole sexual utilitarian philosophy of the culture, often inflicting upon their children, their two children, loneliness for a brother or a sister. The couples become more materialistic. I'm not going to review these studies. Les referred to them earlier. There are numerous studies demonstrating the increased psychiatric illness associated with contraception, which seems to be not based on psychopharmacology, but on psychology, for reasons I've reviewed with you earlier. The loss of libido occurs frequently because as John Paul II has written in Love and Responsibility, when you look at self-giving in marriage, you look at the giving to the romantic side of marriage, the giving to marital friendship, and the giving to betrothed love. And so what happens here when you contracept is that frequently, especially for men do this more than women, you tend not to communicate as much. You tend not to work enough on the marital friendship, on romantic love, and expect intimacy. When a man expects intimacy from his wife without being sensitive to romantic love and married love, loss of libido is extremely common in the woman. Why? Because she feels he doesn't really care about me fully as a person. He wants to use me sexually, but is not attending to the romantic aspect of our marriage, nor to the friendship aspect of our marriage. This is not a minor problem in couples who come in for marital therapy, where there's marital conflict, that the marital friendship and the marital romantic aspect has been damaged because of this whole darkness of the contraceptive mentality that has invaded that marriage. As related to earlier, you have a loss of trust, growth in selfishness, weakening the romantic aspect of marriage, and men in particular, a lack of refinement in how they relate to a wife, damage in faith. It does wound sexual intimacy, views children as a threat, not a gift. So what this does essentially, the worst thing this does psychologically to a person is it takes you from being a person who finds fulfillment in giving yourself, and it turns you in. Okay? And when you get turned in, the more you get turned in, the more depressed you are. This is why, quite frankly, the most beautiful city in the world, many people would say, Paris, has per capita the highest use of serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Okay? Because dogs don't make you happy. 2 dogs, 3 dogs, 5 cats, doesn't cut it. You want children, you want to be giving, but the people are in major denial about that conflict. All right, so major difficulties occur in the use of, and so I'm not going to go over this too much. Les has reviewed this. The resulting pathologies, the STDs, increase in psychiatric illnesses, personality disorders. Let's look at teenagers for a moment. What happens to teenagers? Here's a study of almost 14,000 teenagers. By the way, here's the author, Halifors, D.D. If you do a search on the National Library of Medicine, take his name, type it in, get his email address, send him an email, he'll be flattered, and he'll send you the article. So what did we find here? That the depression, 4% of girls with multiple sexual partners experience depression. Only 4% of girls who are virgins experience depression. And why do you feel depressed? You feel depressed because you feel used. You're not valued as a person, like all this hooking up that's going on in college campuses. You don't feel valued as a person, so you're not going to be happy. The more you do it, the less happy you are. John Paul II warns us in the Gospel of Life, and that the negative values inherent in the contraceptive mentality are such that they strengthen the temptation to abortion when life is conceived. And certainly the studies refer that numerous international studies on post-abortion illnesses one can find. Now, I think Brad will go into this in the next lecture, and Les referred to it earlier, rise in contraceptive, rise in abortion, rise in divorce. Severe damage to the family. Here's some data from an interesting article called The Catholic Hiroshima, that being contraception. In 1968, 338 annulments in the church. 6 years later, contraceptive mentality beginning to move powerfully within the church, darkly within the church, almost 30,000 annulments in the church. 90s, 40,000 annulments in the church. What about single parenthood? We had this incredible growth in single parenthood. These are some of the most painful, personally, one of the most challenging aspects of my work is dealing with single parents and children. To see this overwhelming pain brought upon the family, upon the Catholic family, A, beginning with contraception, B, leading to divorce. That's almost always the dynamic that operates here, okay? Severely wounded children, whom John, in Letter to Families, John Paul II will refer to them as orphans with living parents. Not in every family, but in other families, that their parents are so wounded. These children are almost parentless. So we're creating a new demographic with the poor working single mother because of the contraceptive mentality. The damage to singles is similar to married couples, a loss of trust, a loss of belief in the beauty of love, fear of marriage, certain pessimism about love, increased narcissism, using others, substance abuse, fear of commitment, promiscuity. A good new book on this matter is a book called Unprotected by Dr. Anonymous. She's not anonymous anymore. She came out the closet, so to speak. Her name is Dr. Grossman. I think she's at UCLA, one of the California medical centers, universities rather. She describes the severe pathology in young women. And as Les was referring to earlier, you do nothing about it. Don't present them the truth. Just here's some contraception, here's some serotonin reuptake inhibitors, here's this, here's that, without presenting them the truth of why they're depressed and why they're troubled. Another excellent article is entitled Dorm Brothels. This is by a theology professor at Loyola in Baltimore, where he posits that he really criticizes university presidents. He says, really, because of the conditions of dormitories, and he's speaking of Loyola and others, it's impossible to do serious academic work because of the sexual mentality, contraceptive mentality, substance abuse. All right, and when I had been a family practitioner for 3 years, and like Les, mistakenly, 70 to 73, I prescribed oral contraceptives to my patients, knew really nothing about them almost, And then there were basically 3 sexually transmitted diseases, 3 or 5, now they're 26 or 30. By the way, just an aside here, but when I was in family practice, if somebody came in with a sexually transmitted disease, say of syphilis, that I would fill out a report that to the health department in Philadelphia. I practiced in the inner city, North Philadelphia, North Central Philadelphia. And then the health department would send someone out to that person who had syphilis and ask them, okay, who are your partners? Let's track this down. So this is good epidemiology for health, okay? But then, interestingly enough, the AIDS epidemic came by. And all the standards that were used for epidemiology were put aside. So AIDS was granted epidemic exceptionalism. And why? Because had the same questions been asked, how many sexual partners lay in the bathhouses last night? I had about 8 to 10 sexual partners. Who were they? I have no idea who they were. So had that been done, had the standards that have been used in the field of venereal diseases been applied to AIDS, the truth would have emerged about a lifestyle marked by rampant promiscuity, anonymous sexuality, inability to commit, and so powerful was the homosexual influence on the government that was blocked. With the result that the methods that could have been used to prevent the spread of AIDS were not employed, not allowed to be employed. So we're getting to the point which the Holy Father referred to as the dictatorship of relativism that we have a little bit of a struggle with. So we have demographic winter coming, rapid fall in population in Europe. This is an article about the economic consequences of the contraceptive mentality, not quite labeled this way, in the Wall Street Journal. 1950, 7 workers for each retired person. 2030, 3 workers for each retired person. Damage to children is very significant. Not only the divorce trauma, the loneliness, the sadness for siblings, single parent, poverty, post-traumatic stress disorder, numerous types of anxiety disorders in children, separation anxiety disorders, various oppositional defiant disorders, anger disorders. What about the damage to faith? This is a very powerful pastoral letter on contraceptives, very courageous, by a bishop in St. Augustine, Florida, Bishop Victor Gallione. He describes contraceptives as a spiritual cancer which is eating away at the mystical body of Christ. Quite powerful. It is the taproot of all evil in the family, in the church, and in society. I can tell you as a psychiatrist, it is the cause of enormous suffering in marriages, in single people, in separated and divorced people, in children. It's been the cause of extraordinary suffering. It's been the cause of enormous conflict within the church. And no question in my mind, a factor in the crisis in the church. Because if you don't preach the truth about sexual morality, you're less likely to live it. Damage to the family. We basically have the two-child family in the Catholic community. Previously, Catholic families had an average of 5 children. The consequences of this, among many, many consequences, a marked decrease in vocations to the priesthood and religious life, and a profound decreased influence, a healthy Catholic influence on the culture. The spiritual damage, I'm going to make a little bit of my own area of expertise here as a psychiatrist, but treating the whole person, you see the loss of a sense of sin, which is dangerous to people. I mean, you don't know yourself. You're denying a weakness in your personality, guilt. And so since the late 60s, we have had major anger within the church, misdirected at the magisterium, the church's teaching, particularly the church's teaching of sexual morality. In the course I'm teaching at John Paul II, a number of mothers talked about how women who are in their 50s, talked about how with their teenage daughters, they'd come back from Catholic high schools, and they would be trying to teach their children the truth about sexual morality. In Catholic high schools, they were teaching them the opposite. They were teaching them the sexual utilitarian philosophy in Catholic high schools. We certainly have that going on in the Jesuit college that I attended in about 2 years ago in their diversity week. There was a writer in the paper, Catholic paper, who attended some of the conference in diversity week. And she reported in this paper, the Catholic paper, exactly what this theologian said. And his teaching was very clear. He was out to undermine the church's teaching on homosexuality. Now, very fortunately, the bishop in that diocese in charge of education responded boldly. One paragraph from this person trying to undermine the church's teaching on homosexuality, another paragraph by the bishop correcting him throughout the entire article. This was a godsend. And in the past, this wouldn't have happened. This teaching would not have been publicly corrected. And that's what's needed. Public correction is needed. You know, people try to hide under the church's teaching. No, it should be pointed out. There should be correction. St. Paul has told us, "In wisdom made perfect, correct and admonish one another." Now, contraception has had a very terrible impact on parenting, on father and mother's ability to parent their children. In this sense, this is one view of parenting or leadership styles: the authoritarian, we use demands and threats, little reasoning; permissive, high in affection or wanting approval, wanting acceptance; and authoritative. So what's happened here, as we only have 2 children, I've given conferences and numbers of school to Catholic educators on how to deal with anger in the classroom. And the Catholic educators will say, well, we can't dare to correct these children, because this is the perfect prince and the perfect princess. And so what's happened here is maybe we're at one extreme of authoritative parenting, authoritarian parenting, where now we've moved to the other extreme of permissive parenting, where parents lack the ability to really form their children and develop healthy psychological character. So they're afraid to correct their children, particularly in regard to their selfishness. One of the major weaknesses that develops a pathological character, a wounded character, because they're afraid their children won't be around to love them. So authoritative parent, this is the best style of parenting. Now, I'm going to make several comments on the priesthood. I have great respect for the priesthood. But I think the contraceptive mentality has impacted every area of the culture, including the priesthood. And it's influenced the permissive leadership style, which has interfered with proclaiming the truth about sexual morality. Just as this contraceptive mentality has led to massive abandonment of the sacrament of marriage, it has also led to an unprecedented abandonment of the sacrament of holy orders. What has occurred here in many ways is that psychology in many seminaries replaced theology. Spiritual direction was replaced by psychology. The Pope recently criticized this to the German bishops. He said, look, role-playing and all that business, the seminary, Form the seminarians properly. And so this has been a problem in a number of seminarians. And so also you have the selfishness, liturgical abuses. It becomes my liturgy, just as it becomes my procreation, my decision. And so this same problem has occurred. So we have in the society a loss of the sense of the sacred, about the sacrament of marriage, about the liturgy, really major damage to faith. We look here a moment on this is again from the article, Catholic Hiroshima. In 63 to 69, as the contraception, everyone thought there were going to be major changes, 8,000 requests for dispensations from holy orders. And then, in a period less than 2 years, when Humanae Vitae was released, 6,000 requests. But during that same period, with requested 22,000 left the priesthood without any formal request for dispensation. Almost 100,000 priests and religious have given up their calling to the priesthood in religious life. The devastating impacts, of course, on our Catholic culture. In Catholic education, something equally, we mentioned this earlier, has happened. We have, beginning in the late 60s, a rejection of the Church's teaching on sexual morality. And so, a number of schools, you have principals who say, no, we don't want the parish priest coming into the school. Why? Because he's harsh. He's not sensitive to children. Why? Because he's going to preach the truth. And so because he's going to preach the truth, he would offend our children. So we don't want him in the school. And, we have, people who want to give conferences on NFP or contraception in parishes or in school. They're told, no, you're not permitted to do that. I was talking to a gynecologist in the Midwest. She said a nurse developed a film on NFP. Okay? It was used in this diocese for 6 months. It was NFP, and theology of the body was in the film. The film, she was then told, time out, the film has good qualities to it, but we're not going to continue this film in this diocese unless you remove all references to theology of the body. Okay? That's where we are. Okay? And we know that God is purifying the church, but it's a challenge because it's a deeply rooted rebellion here, rejection of crucial teaching, and the consequence has been disastrous. There's no, as Brad wrote in his article, there's no longer any intellectual defense of this. You cannot intellectually defend this position of rejecting the church's teaching on sexual morality, and yet the rebellion goes on in our high schools, in our colleges, even in some seminaries. It continues to go on. Again, here's the great gift. One of the great gifts, John, thank you, John, for your work on this. John Paul II is the great gift, his writing, Love and Responsibility, Theology of the Body. So read in this new, if you haven't read this, I encourage you to go online, USCCB, www.usccb.org, and read the 7-page document. That living God's design for human sexuality can be difficult. It can be difficult, but love is demanding. Love is not easy. But we're called to endure to the end, and the bridegroom is with us to help us, and the Holy Spirit is with us to help us. We're not left alone, and the power of God can help us to lead, to live the way we're meant to live. So we'll end this discussion, presentation, by these comments from Married Love, that the Church's teaching on marital sexuality is an invitation for men and women, an invitation to let God be God, to receive the gift of God's love and care, and to let this gift inform and transform us so we share that love with each other and with the world.